is highly significant. It's been an incredible week for Rwanda, hosting those two state visits, and the president of Mozambique only a day or two before. And I think it's a very powerful economic statement. Rwanda has strong economic relationships with each country, but more than that, each of these leaders brought private sector delegations and inked various deals while they were in the country. So I think for President Kagame, who's both the chair of the African Union and also leading an ambitious economic agenda at home, it's been really quite a week.
Grant, now we did see about yesterday China signing up to 15 bilateral pacts with the government of Rwanda, but also India came through with about 7 of them and extending a credit line worth $200 million. Now tell me, from your perspective, how significant is this for both countries, for China and for India, doing this with Rwanda, and what's in it for them?
I think it is a strong statement because of the ties with Rwanda, but also because of the broader symbolism and economic depth of these visits in terms of India and China's relationships with the continent overall. To put this in perspective, if you go back to the year 2000, China and India were the 8th and 9th largest trade partners of the continent. Now, fast forward to 2015, China is #1 and India is #2. And as you look at these trend lines going forward over time, you see that the economic investment, you see that the cultural exchanges, and you see also that this highest level diplomacy of the head of state visits and inking those deals, as you said, that's really a statement of intent for both China and India, that Africa is a priority and that they're going to continue to invest their time and their resources in strengthening these linkages.
You're touching a very interesting point there, but how exactly does China and India's engagement in Africa as an economic powerhouse compare, if you give me that comparison?
Sure, that's a great question in terms of comparing the Chinese approach and the Indian approach. And there's really no comparison in terms of the breadth and the depth between China and any other state at the moment. China is making a very long-term play. They're deepening their linkages in terms of infrastructure investment, but also in terms of cultural exchanges, media, and looking at military exchanges and arms sales, relationships across the board. I think that China is sending a strong statement, as I mentioned, of its long-term priorities and how it sees these relationships over time. Because it's not just about the economics, it's about geopolitical influence, it's about having these relationships in the United Nations and other international institutions, and it's about these types of partnerships in terms of how China sees itself in the world.
Grant, allow me to ask you the last question, and this has to do with the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we definitely know that some of the pacts that were signed in Kigali have everything to do with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, with such aggressive economic engagement from China, what could go wrong, or what's on the downside, the risks that African states could encounter with this?
That's a great question because there's no such thing as a free lunch. And though on the one hand, the One Belt, One Road initiative is bringing large amounts of cash, loans for infrastructure projects, and it's really deepening Chinese investment, there is risk, particularly in terms of states taking on too much debt. And we see that 40% of sub-Saharan African states are at risk of debt distress right now. That's not entirely due to Chinese loans, but China is now the largest bilateral lender to many of these African states. And you also see the fact that Chinese loans are less transparent and they come with less of the trappings of social and environmental considerations and other factors that international financial institutions take great care in considering. And so I think the downside risk is that African states won't necessarily get the best bargain and they won't necessarily have the best terms for these loans, and they may be too indebted at the end of the day to really see the economic benefits of these investments. In Sri Lanka and elsewhere, we've seen the effects of this type of Chinese debt diplomacy, where in Sri Lanka in particular, a debt was essentially repaid by taking over an important port and sacrificing that to the Chinese government. So I hope that even as these infrastructure projects continue to bear fruit, that mindfulness on the part of African governments will ensure that these are transparent deals and that they're really in their best interests.